templates and custom report templates were kind of the de facto standard, I guess, for custom reporting out of finPOWER Connect. They still very much have a place in the reporting space within finPOWER Connect. They allow us to override and update existing report templates, as well as creating completely custom report templates as a completely custom report. They have exactly the same. They appear exactly the same to an end user as they would see if they run up a normal report from Report Explorer. So we have all the same options available to export to Excel, export to PDF, all those kinds of things as well. So once your custom report template has been completed, it will function and appear in your Report Explorer in exactly the same way as a normal report would do, and function in the same way as well. To access the report templates, do so via our admin menu. An option here for report templates. You can see here, obviously we have scripting, but we also have a query page available to us on our report templates. So first things to note with our report template is our report type. And our report type is going to be one of three things. It's either going to be a report, query, or an ad hoc query. I'll run through some examples of each of those. And we will provide, I will provide some samples for download. We'll provide those as download links once the video goes up online. So obviously our reports and our queries are going to enable the second box here, which is our report or query box. And here we're listing all of our built-in finPOWER Connect reports. So all of the reports you can get from your Report Explorer, we have available to us to either override, add to, or remove from. Since we look at our account trial balance options, we do have hide built-in reports. So we have the option if we're overriding the trial balance, as for instance, and we want our version of the trial balance to supersede the existing trial balance, then we can type trial balance in here, comma separated list, and that will hide the default report, and obviously then continue to display ours as being the official trial balance. On the query page allows us to add additional, basically an additional subquery to the main query. So really the really important thing to note is anytime we select report and we select a report in here, the account trial balance report is going to run as it would do normally behind the scenes, and it's going to return a data set or a data table complete with the data that query is going to return. So we run the trial balance, it will do exactly the same thing behind the scenes as our report template. Difference being in here, we can obviously go in and add subqueries, add fields, and we can obviously customize the return of that data. So if we hover over the query window, you can see here we get a tooltip to say the following tables are always available, and they're always available because we've chosen the account trial balance. So we have the account and the client table available. We do have a tooltip up here as well, which does give you some clues as to things that you can do within the query. And we'll obviously look at things like parameters used within queries and things shortly. We have our parameters page. On our parameters page, checked by default is the use default parameters. Now, obviously, the account trial balance has its own. If we run up an account trial balance, it has its own default list of parameters. And those parameters are available by default to us when we choose to override the report on our general page. If we choose to switch that off, we can add custom parameters to our report template in the usual fashion, or we can choose to add all of the parameters as they're defined on the report. If we do that, you actually get to see all of the parameters that are included in the trial balance. So we can obviously add to these, we can remove from these, we can update default values and that kind of thing. Moving on to our layout, we then get to choose how our report is going to look. And again, because we based this on an existing report, we will have a list of selectable columns. These are all the columns that are available by default to the account trial balance. So we can select the column. It'll default the type, which is obviously our data type, which is going to be a code. And then we have our width and scale option. These can be a little confusing at times. But essentially what these do is obviously define the widths of our columns in our report. So TWIPS is a unit of measurement, which is, I think if we hover over our information bubble here, it does give you a little bit of information about TWIPS. 567 TWIPS to a centimetre, 1440 to an inch. So they're a very, very small and precise unit of measurement, and they were used historically for programming purposes. So we can set a fixed width in TWIPS for our columns, or we can, and then we can additionally add a scale weight. Now the scale weight is used to determine basically a priority for how wide those columns are going to scale to if we, for instance, flip the report to landscape over portrait. So if we have a scale weight of 10, then it's going to obviously scale larger than something that has a scale weight of 2. So by going ahead and dump in the standard report columns for the trial balance, you can see here that things like our currency values have a scale weighting of 2, so then they're going to add a width in TWIPS of 860. And obviously these are going to then scale much smaller than something like our account name field, which is obviously going to scale to take up the rest of the room. You can see down the bottom here that we do get a preview, so that we can actually we can be in control of exactly how a report looks as we're making changes in here. Some of this is a little bit suck it and see. You're going to have a play around with things, but obviously, as you can see here, there's a button on the grid that allows you to dump in all of the columns as they're defined on the default report. So if you look at the default report, you can see here that these columns, the units of measurement that have been used and the scaling that's been used for the default report. So they give you a pretty good idea, or a pretty good starting point at least. When you come to adding custom columns or a completely custom report, you will, instead of selecting a column from the list, if we were going to define one in a query, and I will show you some examples of those shortly, the name that you enter into your column must match the name of the column that you return in from your query. So if you have a field and you've aliased that field, then the alias for that field name must go in here, and then it will display correctly in the report. So it's just a really important thing to note. That column name, like I say, whilst you can select existing ones, if you're going to create new columns, your column names are must relate back exactly to those in your query. Okay, go ahead and have a look at some we've made earlier. So the first one we'll have a look at is a client list with industry code. So here we've used a type of query. We've used our client list, and as I say, this is the build. Oh, I think I might have just. Yep. Okay, that's all right. I've got people waving at me out of my window, so I assume I must have come offline for a second there. But hopefully you didn't miss too much. As I say, this is, as I was just saying, this is the client list query that underpins the standard client list report in Report Explorer. And the difference here being that we have added an additional field to include in our report. We've decided we're going to add the industry code, which is not available to us via the standard client list report. So you can see here, just by adding industry code as custom industry code, it knows here that we already have the client table available to us. It's obviously the client list query that we're using. It's going to use the client table. Industry code is a field on the client table, albeit not part of the standard report. parameters, and these are basically the standard parameters that are included with the report. And then in our layouts, you can see here we've added an additional column, made it visible, called industry code. It's going to sit on the end, and that industry code is going to relate back to our query. So if we run our report, see here, review our report, you can see that pulled through the industry code. So really, really simple, just a way of adding to an existing report in finPOWER Connect. And that's just using a standard query. Our unearned interest report is a type of report, and we're going to base this report on our account trial balance. So you can see here, in this instance, we have no query. We're going to handle everything via our script code. On our parameters, we have dumped in the standard parameters for the trial balance report. And in our layouts, we've added 3 columns, one for interest, interest earned, and interest unearned. Again, these 3 columns aren't available to the account trial balance by default. It just might be unearned, certainly the interest earned and unearned are not. Cool. So therefore, we need to add these to the query that gets executed behind the scenes. The reason we're not going to use a query this time is because in order to calculate those values, we need to interrogate the account schedule. You can see here, if we move to script code, we have an event ID called dataset update. So anytime that we use an existing report template as our base, it will return a dataset, and you can see here we have our dataset. This is some default code that's added to the dataset update. We'll run through the script events in more detail in a moment. So our dataset is basically now going to contain, at the point dataset update runs and this code executes, our dataset is going to be full of all of the information that was returned from the underlying account trial balance query. From here, we can interrogate our dataset and extract out our data table. So our dataset has a collection of tables. Our reports will only contain one table. So DT equals dataset tables 0. We're going to add 3 columns. Columns we're going to add are obviously our interest earned and unearned, and we're going to explicitly define these as decimal columns. Next job is to loop through the rows that were returned in our query. And we're going to initialize our additional rows in here. So you can see here that we have to initialize these to db_null.value. Nothing won't do the job here, and that is because of the way that data tables work. So initialize those additional rows. We're going to calculate our additional interest fields. So our interest earned and interest unearned, and then we're going to update our rows at the end. So in essence, we have our data table, which already has all the columns from the query. We've added 3 more columns. We've looped through the rows, and for each of those columns, we've plonked in a value. The last thing we do is in our update exportable columns event is to add each of these columns as exportable columns. So basically, when we come to run the report, you can see here there's a data export, and down the bottom here we can choose which columns we wish to include in the export. If we scroll down to the bottom, you can see here we have our 3 custom columns. Okay, they would not be there if we were to comment those out. So if you're going to add columns to an existing report, just make sure you then update your exportable columns using the appropriate event. You can see here that those columns are now no longer available to us because we haven't included them as exportable columns. And if we run the report, see here we have our result showing our 3 new columns. As with everything with finPOWER Connect, when you're coding these things, it pays to have a it pays to have a good understanding of what reports are available to you out of the box. Obviously, rather than creating an entirely custom report each time, if we can get 50, 60, 90% of the way there using an existing report, and all we have to do is write a very small amount of code as here to populate the rest of it, then obviously that's far more desirable than having to go and code everything from scratch. So again, it is worth familiarizing yourself with the user interface and with the reports that are available by default to you. So just to, if we go and add a new report, so just to look at our script code events. You can see previously we had used these bottom two here, dataset update and update exportable columns. And which events are going to fire are largely dependent upon what you have selected as your options here. If you have chosen a completely ad hoc query, or you have chosen our generic columnar report, which is obviously not based on an existing report template, then different events will fire. As you can see, dataset update is modifying a report's dataset, so it's adding new or updating existing columns. So that assumes that a report has been selected on our general page and we have a data set to manipulate, as per the previous example. If we do not, and we have chosen a generic columnar report, or we have chosen an ad hoc query, then this will not run. This report here will not run. And instead, we should be using our dataset fetch. So in this instance, we do not have an underlying data set already, and we must therefore go ahead and create our data table, create a query, run the query, and update our data set accordingly. And I can show you an example of that in a second. The other particular events of note are obviously our after parameters initialize and finalize. Anyone that's worked with documents previously will be familiar with these. Basically, any parameters that have been entered on our parameters page, we have the option of updating or adding, removing via these events here. So after parameters initialize will fire at the point that the initial values are calculated. So the parameters screen is being presented to the user. So we can add defaults and things via this event here. After parameters finalized, the user's made their selections in the parameters, and we have the opportunity to do things like validate whatever that selection and things may have been. Those two, the dataset fetch and the dataset update, along with the bottom one, are really the only ones I've paid too much attention to. Finally, we'll have a look at an ad hoc query and an ad hoc query. So this is not based on an existing report. This is purely going to be some SQL that we run via our query window. No script code either. This is wholly and solely going to be our going to be done from our query. And you can see here we're specifying the account ID, the account name, and account of the clients for each account as client count. So we come into our layout. You can see here the three columns. These mirror exactly the columns that we're returning in our query. And the headings are obviously how they're going to appear in the report. If we were to add parameters to this report, we can pick those parameters up also in our query. You can see here on a right click, you can see here we have our parameters. So any parameters that we add to the query are available in here. So you can add them as smart tags. So they're going to be useful in something like a where clause, where account ID equals and your parameter. It's a wee bit like that. So very, very, very useful. You can query the database directly, and as I say, that report will run as a normal report template would do. But obviously, just bear in mind any parameters you add will have to be, unlike the reports where we're basing it on an existing reports and the parameters are already handled. You'll have to handle those parameters yourself in your query. And finally, a generic columnar report. And as I said before, this also allows us to basically, essentially, this is going to be doing everything by code rather than a query. And this is also not based on an existing report. So as you can see here, we're using our dataset fetch. We're actually creating a new dataset. We're creating a query builder, building up a query, executing our data to a data table, updating our dataset with the data table, and then resetting our source to our dataset. You can see here that again, our columns must match the columns that we're returning in our query in this case. We can run that report. You can see here the output of that query. So say that's a very brief overview of report templates. That would normally I would normally dig down and we'll probably do a couple of hours on report templates, but that's a very brief 20 minutes or so just to give you an idea and a taste for what report templates can do. As I say, very, very powerful and very, very useful for overriding and updating existing reports. And as I say, I would urge you to go away and have a look at what reports and things are available. Familiarize yourself with what's already there out of the box and what you could be using as a base for any custom reporting that's required for any of your clients.